Today we're going to talk about how God used Hesed to free the people of Israel from Egypt. So, let's talk about it.
Hello and welcome back to Now Let's Be Honest, and welcome to our Hesed video. If this is not your first video, you can go back. We've had a few before these. One video explaining kind of what Hesed is and what this study is, and then we have a few videos over the occurrences of Hesed in Genesis. But if this is not your first video, welcome back. We're excited to have you back. And we are now in Exodus. So we've made it through Genesis, we're now in Exodus, and this is just kind of a passion project. We're just working through every occurrence of Hesed throughout the entire Bible. And yeah, it just gives kind of some videos in between the prophet videos, kind of going back and forth.
Yeah, it's going to be kind of fun because we've covered Genesis, and we're not doing one occurrence of Hesed per video. We're actually covering multiple each time, but starting with Exodus, we're actually going to slow down just a little bit because the way that Hesed starts showing up in this book in particular is really formative to how we're going to understand the word and the term and the concept going forward. And so we're going to cover a little bit less over particularly this week and next week, and then we'll probably start picking it back up again. But I just want to give a little bit a clarifier there.
Yeah. And if you want to have access to any of the slides that we have, you can go to nowletsbehonest.com/resources. And if you want to support us on Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/David Tate.
Yep,
right?
That's correct.
There we go.
Yep, and so I'm just going to pray for us real quick, and then we are just going to hop right in to discuss Hesed in the book of Exodus. Dear Lord, thank you so much for allowing us to be here, right now, today. I pray that as we go through this study of your word, particularly by tracing this one word in your word, God, I pray that you'll just kind of open up our hearts and our minds to really just understand what this term is all about, how important it is in regards to our relationship with you, and that we won't just pursue this in a way that just kind of puffs us up with knowledge, but that we'll actually be transformed by it, and that by learning how you are a God of Hesed, we will learn to be people of Hesed as well, God. We thank you for everything that you are. We thank you for everything that you're doing in this world and beyond this world. And it's in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so we are going to be jumping in, like we said, into Hesed in the book of Exodus. And as you can see here, I've changed a little bit of our background. Before, I had the background of Adam and God touching fingers from Michelangelo's Creation of Man. Yeah, I forgot the name of it. Yeah, but now we got Charlton Heston as Moses in the famous movie. And I've called it Hesed in Exodus at Sinai. Right, and just some fun facts. I kind of have been breaking this down every time so far. Like we talked about this in Genesis. We're going to do this every time we get to a new section in our series. And Hesed appears 4 times in the book of Exodus. I believe it was, 11 times in Genesis?
Yeah,
so it appears significantly less amount of times in Exodus, but the themes of it are throughout the whole book, and the times that it does occur are actually very, very important. Whereas in Genesis, we're kind of just getting an introduction to what exactly Hesed is, but going into Exodus, we're going to actually get to see some really... it seems like the theology of Hesed is really becoming a lot more fleshed out and stuff like that. And Michael Card, in his book, Inexpressible, which is literally the book on Hesed, he says that in Exodus, where the word occurs only 4 times, Hesed leaps ahead in meaning and is used by God himself to describe his character. And we're going to see that in particular whenever we get to next week's video, where we're going to be spending literally the entire week in Exodus chapter 34. Right? We're going to be spending all of our time just in those last 2 occurrences of Hesed, because it's a very, very crucial moment, and once we understand Exodus 34, it's going to make the rest of this whole study a lot easier. But we're not going to be in that one today. Today we're going to be in Exodus chapter 15 and Exodus chapter 20, which, if you've been studying the book of Exodus at all, you'll know that this is in the Song of Moses after they pass through the Red Sea, and also in the 10 Commandments, right? And so these are our first 2 occurrences of Hesed in the book of Exodus. And so what I thought we'd do, I'm going to scroll to the next slide here, but do you think you could maybe just give us a little bit of a recap of the book of Genesis? Just I'm a big context person, and since we're not covering as many occurrences today, I figured maybe we could spend some more time on context. Could you give us a quick recap on the book of Genesis? And then I'll pick us up and kind of give us a recap of Exodus to get us to where we are right now. Sound good?
Yeah. So in the book of Genesis, that's whenever God creates the heavens and the earth, and he creates man, and man chooses sin, and so he falls away. But God creates this seed, this promised seed that we're following through the book, and he has made this promise that he wants to dwell with man again. And so we're following this seed, trying to figure out who is going to be this redeeming person. And we see society kind of falling further and further away. The flood happens, people are repopulating, and then God chooses this man named Abraham. And so it's going to be through Abraham and ultimately the Israelites that he's going to reveal the promise through. And when it comes to specifically the word Hesed in Exodus, we see a lot of like interpersonal relationships is the way that it's used. It's used between like husband and wife. It's used between just relationships of one person to another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so we basically just follow the whole story of Genesis. You know, you get Abraham, he has a child named Isaac, has a child named Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons, and our last few occurrences of Hesed were particularly focused on this one son named Joseph. And through the story of Joseph, long story short, it's really the last big chunk of Genesis is following this one guy's story. The people of Israel all end up in Egypt, right? And so we see that God's covenant with Abraham is being fulfilled because we see that he does have a family, right? God basically promised Abraham 3 things: land, seed, and blessing, right? He said that I'm going to give you this promised land, I'm going to give you this promised seed, like a family, and I'm also going to bless the world through you, and I'm going to be a blessing to you. At the end of Genesis, we see 2 out of those 3 things being fulfilled, right? Abraham has the family, and Abraham has the blessing, right? The people of Israel are populating, and they are being a blessing to others, and are being blessed by God. The issue is that they're not in the land. Right? And so whenever we flip the page from Genesis to Exodus, hundreds of years pass, and the people of Israel are dwelling in Egypt this entire time. And over those hundreds of years, they have been populating like crazy. They are fulfilling God's commandment to be fruitful and multiply. But this causes the Egyptian king to get a little bit worried because as time passes, a pharaoh arises up who did not know who Moses was. And historically speaking, there might be some cool reasons to think like why that is, but I'm not going to get into that today because that would just totally deviate us, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And so this pharaoh rises up who does not know who... Oh, did I say Moses a second ago? I meant to say Joseph.
Yeah. You said Moses.
A pharaoh rises who doesn't know Joseph, and basically he issues out this edict saying that he wants all the baby boys killed. And that is because he doesn't want them to form an uprising, because in Egyptian history, that was a thing that had happened before. And that's what happens a lot of the times whenever you just have a lot of slaves. Like, they will rise up against you. And so they start killing off all the baby boys. But one family, they protect their child. They place him in a basket, which, interestingly enough, the Hebrew word there is teba, which is the same word for ark that was used for Noah, right? And so once again, you have a figure being saved from destruction by being placed in the water and floating while all these others are dying. And so you have Moses being delivered, and with a huge plot twist, he ends up being raised up in Pharaoh's household, and he is like a prince of Egypt, but... eventually, he starts getting concerned for his fellow Hebrew brethren. He kills an Egyptian soldier who is beating a Hebrew slave, and he flees into the desert. This is all in the first few chapters of Exodus. And then God shows up to him, right? God shows up to Moses, and what we see in Moses is he is a basically embodiment of the people of Israel, right? You have this guy who grows up in Egypt, he flees into the wilderness, and he encounters God on Sinai in fire, right? So God shows up in a burning bush. We're going to see the same thing with the people of Israel. They grow up in Egypt, they leave Egypt, and they meet God at Sinai when God comes down in fire, right? So Moses is kind of prefiguring all this stuff.
Right.
He shows up there, he encounters God, and God says, I'm going to send you back and save my people. And that's exactly what Moses does. Moses goes back, and over the next few chapters of Exodus, we basically see God revealing his glory to the people of Israel and to the people of Egypt, but also hardening Pharaoh's heart constantly so that Pharaoh doesn't quickly release the people, because God really wants to show how powerful he is so that everybody will know who this God really is. It's really the biggest moment that God has ever revealed himself, really in all history, because this is the climactic moment where you just see how big God is, and whenever you go through the rest of the Old Testament, they're going to constantly be looking back to the story of the Exodus, because this is where God unveiled his glory, right? And this is through Moses, right? Well, eventually, long story short, the people of Israel are freed, right? There's this whole thing with the Passover, which is instituted, where there's a lamb that's slain, and then this angel of death passes over, and some people are killed, some people are not. And finally, Pharaoh buckles. He says, you know what? Get out of here. And so the people the people of Israel leave.
Yep.
And they eventually, God guides them this one direction. He doesn't want them going across the land because he doesn't want them to go to war against the Philistines lest they get afraid. And so instead, he guides them to the water. But Pharaoh decides that he doesn't want the Israelites to leave anymore, and so he chases after them. And so now here we have the people of Israel, and they're literally between an army and a body of water. They're surrounded, and they have no way to get out. And then God does the miraculous thing, right? He does the least expected thing possible, and he literally parts the waters and allows them to walk across on dry ground. And in doing that, he's kind of proving that he is the creator of the universe, right? He is the guy who, at the very beginning, in Genesis chapter 1, separated the waters to bring dry ground from it, right? And so he leads the people through there. And this is really God showing how powerful he really is. And that leads us to Exodus chapter 15, where we are at today, because Exodus chapter 14 is whenever God led them through the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds, depending on your translation there.
Yeah.
And so they get through the sea. They get to Exodus chapter 15, and this is the song that Moses is going to lead them in. Could you just read this first slide for us? And once again, since we're only going to cover 2 instances today, we're going to go a little bit more in depth into the breakdown. You'll see that the word Hesed doesn't even show up on this slide. That's because we're going to actually just be working through the song of Moses.
It gives good context.
It gives us the context so that whenever we actually see Hesed, we know why it showed up there, right? And so let's just read through this first slide first, and then we'll start breaking it down.
Yeah, absolutely. Then Moses and the Israelites sang the song to the Lord. They said, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. The chariots of Pharaoh and his army he has thrown into the sea, and his chosen officers were drowned in the Red Sea. The depths have covered them. They went down to the bottom like a stone. Your right hand, O Lord, was majestic in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shattered the enemy. In the abundance of your majesty, you have overthrown those who rise up against you. You sent forth your wrath. It consumed them like stubble.
Yeah. And so this is just, once again, the beginning of this song. Really, the song is actually, let's see, how long is it? I've just got my Bible right here. It's actually 19 verses long. I don't know if I put all 19 verses in this presentation here, because I probably should have scrolled through it ahead of time. But here we have the beginning of this. And if you've been with me in my prophet series, which this whole Hesed thing is really just kind of our way of killing time while I'm in the background preparing for more videos in the prophet series, because that going through the Old Testament prophets, it's actually a lot harder to go through just because it's all poetry, and poetry by just definition, it's a lot harder to interpret, and there's so many different ways to interpret things, and so I'm trying to be very careful as we go through that so that whenever I make those videos, they're good, and it's not just me like teaching, But the reason I brought that whole thing up is because if you've been with us in the prophet series, we are going through Isaiah, and there's a lot of callbacks to this song in the book of Isaiah, because in many ways the book of Isaiah, you could almost call it Exodus part 2, because it is like the entire book of Isaiah is Isaiah promising this future second Exodus. He's saying that God's going to send the people to exile, but he's going to bring them back, just like he did through Moses, but this time it's going to be through the Messiah, right? And that's what Isaiah is all about. And so we actually have, I believe, this first line right here. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea. I believe we have something almost exactly like that quoted in the book of Isaiah, which is just kind of cool. But what do you think about this kind of just opening part to the song here?
This is a good reaction, like on the Israelite part. It's like they're crossing this Red Sea, and immediately they're going into the song, and the glory is being given to God, which is good. And then also, I think this is just kind of, when you're looking at characters, I think this is a big turning point for Moses, because when you go back and look at the burning bush, Moses didn't want God to use him. He was like, no, like, pick somebody else. He was trying to, like, say other different things for a while and try to make up excuses, and then you get to a few verses later and it says, like, please choose somebody else. Like, I don't want to be the one to do this. I don't want to deliver the people. I don't want you to choose me. But you see his first reaction being leading the Israelites in song and giving glory to God. I think this is a big turning moment for Moses. So that's cool too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This is really a big turning moment for everybody.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite understandably so, because God has just revealed himself in such a powerful way.
Yeah.
They were slaves in Egypt for hundreds of years. And then God shows up. This God that they've probably, I mean, it seems like God first revealed his name to Moses, right? Yahweh. Moses goes back here. He says, hey, I serve the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. His name is Yahweh. This is who he is. And then God shows off how powerful he is. And so for the first time, Moses and the Israelites are seeing how big and awesome and mighty God is. Because whenever you go back to Genesis, you see God doing things, but it's a lot subtler, right? It's like the opening and closing of wombs or something like that. Whereas here, God is like making like all these plagues happen.
Evident,
yes,
where you can see it.
Yeah, it's stuff where nobody can deny what's happening. Like literally darkness in the middle of the day and all these crazy things. And then it culminates in this, right? The waters part and they walk through on dry ground. And as soon as they get to the other side, he brings the waters cascading back down to drown the most powerful army in the known world at that time period. And so, quite understandably, you see this shift in perspective here. And I think it makes sense that this is where Hesed is going to eventually show up, right? Because we've been talking about how Hesed is something that you have no right to expect, and it's something absolutely unbelievable. And this is where God has, thus far, shown himself in the most unbelievable manner possible. And the Israelites didn't really deserve it. I mean, if you actually look into the story, they're the ones who went down to Egypt. Moses did not want to go be this deliverer person. And even whenever Moses was back in Egypt and he had slain that Egyptian soldier, the people mocked him and they were actually kind of upset with him for trying to do something. And he was like, I was trying to help you out. And so these people, they don't deserve the deliverance they've received, but they've gotten it. And so I think it's the setup for Hesed is really, you understand why.
Right.
And so let's walk through this. Okay. They say, I will sing to Yahweh, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea. Just the imagery there is almost of God, like God is like this big hulking figure over the entire earth, and these great mighty warriors who the people of Israel were afraid of, they're nothing but like little toy action figures to God, and God's just picking them up and like throwing them into like what we would imagine as like a pool, right? Like I've got a pool in my backyard. It's like if I went and got those little like army men that kids play with as 4-year-olds, and I just picked those up and threw them into the pool. That's the image that they're painting of God here, right? He has triumphed gloriously, horse and rider that we are so afraid of, he's thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation, right? In English, that alliterates really well. Strength, song, salvation, right? If you're a Southern Baptist preacher, there's your 3 points, right? The Lord is our strength, he is our song, and he is our salvation. And then you break those down for 45 minutes. This is my God, I will praise him. My Father's God, I will exalt him. You have this building up of he's my God, but also my Father's God, right? We are seeing him for the first time, but this is the one that our ancestors have worshipped since Abraham. The Lord is a warrior. Yahweh. So it says Yahweh is a warrior. Yahweh is his name. I think that's kind of cool. First off, you have this portrayal of God as a warrior, which is just something we haven't seen so far.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, we've seen how God has empowered Abraham to be a warrior, like in Genesis chapter 14. But this is the first time where God is kind of like he's just upending nations, right? Like God himself is the one who's triumphing in battle. We haven't seen that so far in the Bible, but it's going to become very prevalent throughout the rest of the Old Testament. I mean, to go back to Isaiah once again, his key message to the people of Israel is trust in God, not in foreign nations. Like that is like if you had to summarize the book of Isaiah, that's what it is. And that's because it goes back to this theology that's revealed right here at the Red Sea. God is a warrior. And then they say Yahweh is his name, which is cool because once again, they probably just learned that this is who their God is, right? They're like, who is Yahweh? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, well, why should we trust in him rather than anybody else? And they just got to see why. 10 plagues, parting the Red Sea, stuff like that. What do you think so far?
It's really cool because I feel like we haven't seen the power of God as much since, like, the first thing I thought of is thinking of, like, the flood. Like, the fact that he was able to control, like, the weather. You saw the power of him there, and that's kind of the first time that you saw that. But this time, I think it's a little bit different because he has, like, he was only saving Noah and his family at that
8
time.
people.
Yeah, but right now he has, like, all of the Israelites. So you see it where it's like he is this powerful God, but he's also like their father, like they were saying. So there's this, like, personal connection and this relationship that you see starting to form while also showing this, like, great power that he has, which is cool.
Yeah, so it's just a totally new perspective of God, and they're responding well to this. Right? I mean, typically, I'm honestly, even for them, 3 days from now, if you just keep reading through Exodus, they're not going to be responding nearly as positively. But right now, they've been delivered, and they were delivered in such an unexpected way that it's undeniable who they were delivered by, right? This is something that God does very frequently. He will put people in impossible situations so that whenever they get out of it, they can't just be like, oh, wow, Moses is a great leader.
Yeah.
No, they've gotten out of this by supernatural means.
Yeah.
And it is very evidently supernatural, and so they have no choice but to recognize that it's God who did it.
Yeah.
And they're responding very positively.
Especially because they're in a situation where they're, like, completely surrounded. Like, you have water on one side and, like, a huge army that definitely outnumbers you on the other side. Like, there is no way you'd be able to get out of that by yourself. So there is only one explanation.
Yeah, and he did it in the most unexpected way. It's not like he just like flattened the army. It's like no, a pillar of fire came down to shield them from the army, and then the waters blew apart. It's like crazy.
What?
Verse 4: the chariots of Pharaoh and his army he has thrown into the sea. It's repeated again, right?
Yeah.
It's that repeated imagery. And the chosen officers were drowned in the Red Sea. The chosen officers, the most highly respected ones.
I was going to say, it also shows, like, first of all, you notice that the first time it said thrown into the sea, but with it being repeated again, it shows that it wasn't like a barely scraped by they came by. Like, it was, like, completely overpowered. Like, they won by a whole bunch type of thing. It wasn't like we had some fatalities, like, we were almost there, and, like, we just barely scraped by, like, you know, the edge of our seat.
Yeah.
It was, like, completely on their side.
Oh, yeah, and you see that in the rest of it, right?
Oh, yeah.
The depths have covered them.
Yeah.
They went down to the bottom like a stone.
Like, they had no chance.
Yeah, they weren't
catching them.
they weren't like they couldn't doggy paddle. They couldn't just like tread water. They were down there. Like the waters came crashing down upon them. And it's very brutal stuff to describe. I think sometimes we can just read this and, you know, we're like, "Oh my gosh," like we just read through it and don't think much about it. But this is a very graphic scene being portrayed here. Yeah. But from the people of Israel's perspective, it's a very beautiful scene, right? These are their oppressors. These are the people who were persecuting them and destroying them and were trying to kill them. And then whenever they stood no chance to be able to deliver themselves, Yahweh came along and delivered them. And so that's really, really cool. Your right hand, Yahweh, was majestic in power. Your right hand, Yahweh, shattered the enemy. So you have the repetition of the right hand right there. In the abundance of your majesty, you have overthrown those who rise up against you. You sent forth your wrath. It consumed like stubble. Interestingly enough, you know what this sounds like? It sounds a lot like a song people would sing to a pharaoh, right?
Yeah.
We recently went to an exhibit over at the Houston Museum of Natural Science. They had a Ramses exhibit. Yeah. And whenever you look at just the type of stuff that people would write about the pharaohs, it's stuff like this, right? In the abundance of your majesty, you have overthrown who rise up against you. You sent forth your wrath, it consumed them like stubble. This is stuff that kings do to people who are opposed to them. And so the people of Israel are responding rightly here because they're recognizing that Yahweh is their king, right? This is how you sing about a king who has just returned triumphantly from battle. But they're not talking about Moses like this. They're talking about Yahweh, and it's Moses who's actually leading them in this.
Yeah.
So that's really cool. Then we move on to the next slide, and you see right there in verse 13, that's where Hesed is going to show up. By the blast of your nostrils, the waters were piled up. The flowing water stood upright like a heap, and the deep waters were solidified in the heart of the sea. Cool imagery here.
Yeah.
Right? The blast of your nostrils. Once again, you see what I mean whenever I say God is being portrayed as like this really big figure? Like just the imagery is that you have this giant sea. And basically what they're saying is that this wasn't anything for God, right? He wasn't having to do anything remarkable.
Work.
He was just blowing your, like, it was like he was just pushing some air out of his nostrils. Kind of like whenever you find like a funny meme on your phone and you just like, it's not funny enough to laugh at. But it's funny enough for you to just like push extra air out of your nose. You're like, that's funny.
Yeah.
That's kind of what they're describing that God did here, right? He just laughed at the Egyptians slightly and boom, the waters parted. Yeah. Right? By the blast of your nostrils, the waters were piled up. And if you go to the previous chapter, it tells you that this took place over hours and hours and hours, right? Over the course of the night, this happened.
Yeah.
So just think about, once again, how big God is. It takes him that long to blow his nostrils out, right? And obviously, he didn't literally blow his nostrils out here, but the imagery that they're going for is that God is so big and so powerful that it takes him that long to push the air out of his nostrils. And just by doing that, the waters pile up.
It's like, whoa.
The flowing water stood upright like a heap, and the deep waters were solidified in the heart of the sea. This is not like what you see in Exodus, Gods and Kings, the movie, where it's literally just low tide. No, literally, the Bible says the water was to the left and to the right, and they walked across on dry ground. Crazy. The enemy said, I will chase, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire will be satisfied on them. I will draw my sword, my hand will destroy them. Here we see, once again, it sounds like, this is like the song that a person would sing whenever a king comes back from battle, right? Because here you have what the enemy is saying. Oh, I will catch them, I will destroy them, I will do it. But you, Yahweh, you said no. Right? It's like, this is like mythical type stuff. It sounds like a legend that you would pass down through generations, but the thing is, it's true. And Moses is the one recording this, and it's like, whoa. Do you have anything to add to that? Okay, cool. Just, I always want to give her a chance to talk, Okay. Yeah. But you blew with your breath, and the sea covered them, right? So he blows out his nostrils, and the seas part. Then he blows with his breath, and the sea falls over the enemies. Even though, like, notice how much they're having to do. I will chase. I will overtake. I will divide. My desire will be satisfied. I will draw my sword. My hand will destroy them. That's 6 different things in verse 9 that the enemy says they're going to do. Yeah. God has to do one thing. He just has to blow his breath.
And then none of theirs is, like, satisfied. Yeah. Just from God's one action. Yep. It completely, like, nullifies all 6 of theirs.
Exactly. They have 6 things. They're like, boom, I'm going to do this. They're, like, having to do all this different stuff to try to capture the people of Israel. And God just blows. And they go down. Yeah. But you blew with your breath, and the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty water. So not only did they sink like stones, they sank like lead, right? Then, you see this transition in verse 11. This is where they take all the stuff they've seen and they apply it. Yeah. Who is like you, Yahweh, among the gods? Right? And this is basically them comparing him to all the other foreign gods, right? Like, literally, it's like, okay, there's Baal, there's Ashtaroth.
They just came from Egypt.
Yeah, they came from Egypt. There's Ra, Ismut, Isis, all these different people. Yeah. There's all these gods. And Yahweh is chief among them all, right? Who is like you? The answer is no one. Who is like you, majestic in holiness, fearful in praises, working wonders? What you see here is that God accomplished exactly what his goal was in going and sending Moses down to Egypt. A lot of the times we wonder why God hardened Pharaoh's heart and stuff like that, but I think the Bible makes it fairly clear. It's because the goal of the Exodus was not merely to get the people out of Egypt, because God could have done that without any plagues. He could have just done it. But the purpose of the Exodus was to display his power to the people of Israel and to the rest of the world. And here in this song, we see that God has accomplished that.
And we see that in later passages, too. Whenever he's, like, having conversations with Moses and stuff like that, and they refer back to the story of the Exodus, and he's saying, you know, like, God, if you don't do this, then, like, Moses is appealing to his glory. He's like, God, if you don't do this, like, all of the people are not going to believe of your power and your glory that you said that you were going to show them and that you did show them. So they refer to that numerous times, too.
For sure. Who is like you, majestic in holiness, right? So you are majestic, which is above all, in your holiness, which is your set-apartedness, right? So you are above everybody in your set-apartedness. There are holy people out there. There are holy gods out there, but you are the most holy of all. Fearful in praises. Even in how we praise you, we have to tremble at the same time, right? Once again, Rich Mullins, awesome God. Listen to it. Working wonders. Nobody's like you in all of these things. Even the things that God has accomplished, it's unlike anything people have ever seen before. And understandably so, even people nowadays, skeptical people, will look at the events in the book of Exodus and they'll doubt them. Because they're like, no, that's too crazy. There's no way that happened. Well, it seems like that's what the Israelites were thinking too. They're like, yeah, we didn't believe it either, but we saw it. Verse 12, you stretched out your right hand and the earth swallowed them. Right? So you see how God's getting his entire body involved in this? Like, he threw them into the sea. He blew out of his nostrils. He blew on them. He stretched out his right hand. And he's doing this all on behalf of the people. This leads us to verse 13. By your Hesed, you will lead the people whom you have redeemed. You will guide them by your strength to your holy dwelling place. Okay, I've got a question for you here. You notice how this is future tense. Right?
Yeah.
So far, everything they're saying is past tense. Past tense, past tense, past tense. You have done this. You have done this. You have done this. And then finally, whenever the word Hesed shows up, they say, you will lead us by Hesed. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it also points to it's interesting how loyal is like that. It's loyal love, because whenever someone has loyalty, that's like a continual thing that you're going to show in past, present, and future. So it's cool how loyal is there, and he's saying that he will lead them. But I think it's probably just like a shift of mind at this point. They're seeing where they came from. They're seeing the power that God just demonstrated. And then it's turning into this like moment of praise and worship, and now he's like, well, if you've done this for us before, they're putting their trust in God and saying, you're going to continue to lead us and to continue to redeem us. So
yeah, I mean, this is just kind of my guess here. I think you're correct, first off, but the thing that I think kind of stands out to me here is this is foreshadowing what God's going to reveal in Exodus 34. In Exodus 34, and this is what Michael Card talked about, in Exodus, God is going to demonstrate that he is a God of Hesed, right? In Genesis, we talked about how really we were just kind of becoming acquainted with what Hesed is, and we were just getting to see kind of just the beginnings of this concept throughout Genesis. In Exodus, it really rises to the forefront as a character trait of God.
Right.
God hasn't explicitly said that yet, and he won't really explicitly say it till chapter 34, but I think what we see here is that the people of Israel have picked up on it. Right? They verses 1 through 12 are describing what God has done for them. And I think they look on that and they say, that is Hesed. Right? God is doing for us what we had no right to expect, yet he still gave it to us abundantly. And whenever they're looking at it, they're saying, okay, why would he do that? Right? We didn't do anything to motivate him to do it.
Right.
We were just doubting him, and we were just waiting and complaining and not doing anything. Our leader didn't want to deliver us. We didn't want him to deliver us to begin with. But God did it. And so they're saying we had no right to expect from it. We didn't do anything to motivate him to do it. The only reason why God did this is because he must be a God of Hesed. Right? That must be
of.
Yes, it must be part of his character. It's kind of like whenever we talk about love, right? There's a reason why it's translated loyal love. Why is God loving? It's who he is, right? We have no reason, like God should not love us, right? We have rejected him, we've rebelled against him, we have sinned against him, we have given him every reason not to. And even before all that, he didn't even have to love us, right? Even before we sinned, he just created us. That doesn't mean you have to love us, but we have to come to the conclusion that that is just part of God's character. I think that's what the people of Israel are doing here. I think they look and they're saying, why did God do this? It must just be that he is a God of Hesed. And so they come to the conviction that if God did this because he's a God of Hesed, then if we continue to follow him, he will lead us according to that same Hesed. And so it's setting us up for chapter 34 when God comes out and he says, yes, I am a God of Hesed. Like, you're spot on. That's exactly right. And so they say, by your Hesed, you will lead the people whom you've redeemed. Because you've redeemed us, and we didn't deserve that. Like, your redemption of us was Hesed, and therefore you will lead us by Hesed. You will guide them by your strength to your holy dwelling place. And keep in mind, given our definition of Hesed, they're admitting that these things are things that they have no right to expect. Right? If he's leading them by Hesed, that means that these things they should not have any right to expect, right? They should not expect God to lead them, because who are they? They're just a lowly people. They're slaves. And he is the almighty God who literally just subdued the most powerful nation with the breath of his nostrils. Right? They have no right to expect this, right? Who are they, right? What is man that you'd be mindful of him? And then they say, you will guide them by your strength to your holy dwelling place. This is talking about the promised land, right? But before that, it's actually going to be talking about Sinai, where he's going to come dwell. And then he's going to come dwell with them in the tabernacle. And then eventually when they get to the promised land, he's going to dwell in the tabernacle and then the temple, right? And the whole thing is that when you go back to earlier chapters in Exodus, it's let my people go that they may worship me in the wilderness, right? The whole point is to get out and to worship God, and they recognize that. And this is like a restoration of Eden, right? They were kicked out of God's dwelling place because of sin. And now, though they had no right to expect it, God is bringing them back to the dwelling place. And they're confident that he will continue to lead them in that direction. I think that's kind of cool. Yeah. And so, cool. Once again, everything is shifting around the word Hesed, right? It only shows up once in this entire song, but it is the reason this entire song exists, right? Everything's been building up to this, and then everything that comes after this is also going to flow from it.
I just want to say that I love, this is just kind of like a poetry structural type thing, but I love where the word Hesed is placed after they're talking about God's power and how amazing he is. And then it comes to this point where he's like, who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Like, they're starting to question, like, oh my gosh, like, who is this? And they're starting to see his holiness and the wonders that he's done. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, Hesed. Like, I feel like I'm getting to, like, realize it with them. You, like, jump into the story and you're, like, imagining them after just walking across dry land, across the Red Sea, and they're just, like, realizing, oh my gosh, like, this is the God that we worship, and, like, he is full of Hesed, and he has delivered us to this place. I just think it's cool where it's at, because you can see their thought process, the way that it's structured, how they got to it, kind of.
Yeah, they're like, cool. There's something different about this God.
Yeah, it's not like the ones that we've seen in Egypt. Like, what is different about him?
Yeah, and sure, he's powerful, but you would expect God to be powerful.
Yeah.
Yes, he knows everything, but you would expect God to know everything, and all the gods profess that. The thing that sets him apart is how powerful he is and how weak we are, and for some reason he's still decided to save us. It's his Hesed.
Yeah.
Well, by that Hesed, you're going to lead us. Good stuff. Yeah. Verse 14, the nations will hear and tremble. Anguish will seize the inhabitants of Philistia. Do you see why they're hearing and trembling? Because they hear that God is guiding them in Hesed. Right? Oh no. The God of Israel guides them. He actually cares for them. The most powerful God of the universe has a people. And he cares for them. Oh no. Like, that means basically we're screwed. He's got a favorite. Oh no. It's going to freak them out. Oh, look, I did put the last few verses. Cool. Then the chiefs of Edom will be terrified. Edom are the descendants of Esau, right? And so you have the descendants of Jacob, the descendants of Esau. And one brother was favored, one brother was not. Later in the Bible, they'll say, God will say, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. Yikes. Then the chiefs of Edom will be terrified. Trembling will seize the leaders of Moab, who are descended from Lot, right? So you had Abraham and then his nephew Lot. Moab came from there. And the inhabitants of Canaan will shake. Canaan descended from Ham, who was, there was Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So you see how this is going backwards in history here? So we start with a descendant of Jacob, and then we have of Abraham, and then of Noah, right? So we have all these different people. You've got Esau, Lot, and Ham. And they're all the side people, right? If you're going back to Genesis chapter 3, where it says there's this seed of the woman and seed of the serpent, these are all the seeds of the serpent, right? You have the ones who deviated, the ones who went the wrong way. But then you've got the seed of Abraham, the seed of Isaac, the seed of Jacob, the seed of Israel. Those are the seed of the women who God is going to be with. Those people are going to tremble. Fear and dread will fall on them. By the greatness of your arm, they will be as still as stone until your people pass by, O Lord, until the people whom you have bought pass by. And the reason why is because they're going to be passing through this land as they go back, right? They're going to have to pass by Edom. They're going to have to pass by Moab. They're going to have to pass into Canaan to reclaim the land that God has given to Israel. Why? Because he is a God of Hesed, which is sometimes translated as covenantal love, right? He made a promise to Abraham, land, seed, blessing. They've got the seed, they've got the blessing. Now they need the land, and therefore the people are going to be trembling because God is guiding them according to his covenantal love.
Right.
And God is like, so it's like almost like they are an army marching, and God's in the lead, and he's like, I've got a promise to fulfill. And the people are like, oh, we just saw what they did to Egypt.
We'll step back.
Egypt already scared us. And did you see what Yahweh did to Egypt? And so they're terrified, right? You can see how this song is just building up. And now all the people who are not part of the covenant are terrified because they see that the God of Hesed is with the people in the covenant. You will bring them in and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, in the place you made for your residence, O Lord, the sanctuary, O Lord, that your hands have established. Once again, talking about the promised land. There's this promise that God has given, and they are holding on to it because of his Hesed. They have no right to expect it from him, but because he said he would, he has given them the right. Interesting. The Lord will reign forever and ever. I like that that's separated as just one separate verse, right? The Lord will reign forever and ever. Once again, who's the king in this situation?
God is.
Yahweh, right? How their focus will shift in the generations to come. But right here, they're thinking correctly. Right here, they're saying, yes, Yahweh will reign forever and ever, and that's good. 400 years later, they're going to be thinking differently. For the horses of Pharaoh came with his chariots and his footmen into the sea, and Yahweh brought back the waters of the sea on them, but the Israelites walked on dry land in the middle of the sea. Right?
It's interesting how they go back to that too. Like, they've deviated so far away from the story, but then it's interesting how, like, that last verse is going to be going back to where God kind of revealed himself in that powerful way.
Well, and I think it's also because of who Pharaoh thought he was.
Yeah.
Right? If you look at just Egyptian culture, Pharaoh thought he was a god, right? But their king is actually the God, right? He's not a god. He is the God, capital G God, creator of the universe. And they're saying, okay, Pharaoh thought he would reign forever and ever, but he can't even keep his army alive.
Yeah.
Our God, he keeps his slaves alive. And here we have been freed from bondage. We are on this other side, and we have a destiny where God is taking us to a promised land. He is going to fulfill his covenant to us, and we are going to be shrouded in his Hesed, and he's going to reign forever.
Yeah.
Really good song.
Yeah.
I mean, just, like, the song is all about the glory of God.
Yeah.
And it's not, like, they're talking about what he's done for them, but it's still about God, right? This is something that I wish that modern worship music did. Right? Modern worship music, we focus on the me aspect of things, and we don't focus as much on God. Whereas right here, they are totally focused on God.
Yeah.
And they're just remarking, like, wow, Hesed. Amazing. And there's Exodus 15. Do you have anything else you wanted to mention about this song before we go into our second occurrence?
I don't think so.
Okay, so there's Exodus 15. Now we go to Exodus chapter 20. And basically what happens in the midst of all this is that a few days later, the people start complaining against God because that's how we humans are. We like rejoice and praise God one moment, then a few minutes later, we're just complaining against him. Yeah. But eventually they get to this place called Sinai, and this is where Moses had met God for the first time. It's also known as Horeb. God had revealed himself to Moses in a burning bush originally, but now what happens is God comes down in fire, in a cloud of fire that makes everybody tremble.
Yep.
And what we're going to see at Sinai, and this is going to be from Exodus through the first half of the book of Numbers, is God is going to reveal his law to the people. Yeah. And just like he made a covenant to Abraham, he's going to make a covenant to Abraham's seed, and he's going to say, okay, guys, here's the situation. I'm going to give you this law, and if you obey the law, things are going to go well with you. If you don't obey it, things are going to go bad. And really, it seems like the whole purpose of this law was to highlight the fact that man could not do it, because even Moses, as he's writing this, kind of anticipates the fact that they're not going to do it. Yeah. And he even knows that they're going to establish a king and stuff. But this is the beginning of that, right? Exodus chapter 20 is whenever God is first revealing his law to the people. Yeah. And he shows up in power and glory. He descends upon the mountain. And what's going to happen is that he's going to proclaim this to the people, and they're going to be so terrified that they're going to send Moses up to talk by himself, right? And they're going to say, Moses, we would actually prefer for you to be a mediator between us and God. We cannot handle God's presence ourselves. And it's kind of a sad moment. It is, because immediately after that, they're going to start sinning, and they're going to start worshiping another God. Yeah. And Moses is going to come down in chapter 32, and he's not going to be happy. Yeah. But this is before all that, right? That's going to set up chapter 34, which we'll talk about next week. Right here, right now, this is whenever God is actually speaking to all the people, right? He's speaking from the mountain, and it's before Moses has gone up to have like the one-on-one interaction. Right. This is where God is publicly speaking to everybody, and he gives what are called, what we call the 10 Commandments. In the Bible, they're called the 10 words, right? The 10 things. And there's really nothing that really sets these commandments apart from the rest of them, other than the fact that they were the ones that were heard by every single Israelite before God went up there. But they have gone down in history as the most prominent ones. And that's because in many ways they do kind of summarize a lot of the stuff. Right. But here we are. I didn't copy all of the commandments on here. I just copied the first few. But we're going to walk through them, and we see that Hesed shows up in verse 6. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through this for us, and then I'm going to ask you for your thoughts. So be thinking up something good.
Sounds good.
God spoke all these words. I, Yahweh, am your God, who brought you from the land of Egypt, from the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on earth beneath, or that is in the water below. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, Yahweh, your God, am a jealous God, responding to the transgression of fathers by dealing with children to the 3rd and 4th generations of those who reject me, and showing Hesed to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You will not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Yahweh, your God in vain. For Yahweh will not hold guiltless anyone who takes his name in vain. All right, so there are the first, 3 commandments right there?
Yes.
And the 4th one would be Sabbath day. 5th one would be honor your parents. 6th one is don't kill. 7th is don't commit adultery. 8th is don't steal. 9th is don't bear false testimony. And 10th is don't envy. Don't covet. Yeah. Sorry, I was just kind of testing my biblical knowledge there. When I really could have just looked down at the chapter. Okay, so what do you think about this?
It's interesting that they translate it as covenant faithfulness. Oh my. Because it's sandwiched between talking about like 3rd and 4th generations and 1,000 generations. And so that's kind of cool because one of the promises is saying that like he's going to bless his seed through many generations. But also it's something, again, that they don't necessarily have to expect.
Yeah.
Like they don't have to, especially knowing that they're not going to keep the laws that are given and that they're not going to obey what's going to happen. But yet God is already prefacing, before they even know whether or not they're going to follow it, is already prefacing it with that he's going to have this covenantal faithfulness, this Hesed, that he's going to show them for generations and generations.
Yeah. Do you see why I really wanted to do this series, though? I mean, you're the one who recommended it. Yeah. But do you see why I'm so passionate about this word and why it frustrates me so much that we don't talk about it?
Yeah.
Because it's translated differently almost every time, right? So as readers of the English Bible, we're very quick to overlook it, right? That's why, like, I kind of just wish that we would just transliterate it and just put Hesed, or at least be consistent. Like, I know the King James uses loving kindness a lot, and some other translations have picked up on that, but they still don't use it every time. I wish that we would just use it every time, because it seems like Hesed is such a crucial and fundamental aspect of the faith. I mean, whenever you get to the New Testament, you encounter the word grace a bunch of times, and that's kind of what Hesed really is, but we never translate it consistently. And so that's why, if you're a person who's been reading the Bible in English, or really any language other than Hebrew, you're going to overlook this pretty much. And that's why I'm like, I want to do this series, because I want to draw our attention to how crucial this is. Like, you'll realize that a lot of the climactic moments in the Bible hinge around this concept of Hesed. And if you, like, really it kind of ties it all together, right? Because whenever you're reading different words, you're not going to pick up on that climactic moment. But whenever you realize it's the same word, it kind of gives it this air of, like, building up, and it says Hesed, and you're like, got it. Right? Because right here, this is a big, big moment. But if it just has covenant faithfulness, you'll just kind of breeze past it. Because you don't see that phrase a lot, and you're like, oh, that's not that important. But if you saw Hesed, you'd be like, I see what God's saying there.
Well, also, we see that this word Hesed is like a backbone to the Israelites. Like, we're in the 3rd commandment, and God is using this word. But even if we go back to, like, chapter 15, whenever it's this song, God's just revealed himself in this amazingly powerful way. They cross the Red Sea, and the first way, they're starting to describe him when they realize, like, who is this God, is they start talking about his Hesed and how he's going to show it to them. So you see that this is going to be like a backbone to their society, to the Israelites as a whole, that's going to get them from one place to the next, to get them to the promised land, to redeem them, to continue from generation to generation. So if we understand what that word is, we're just going to have, like, a better understanding overall. If it's the backbone of something, like, you want to know what that is.
Well, speaking of music, I mean, for this whole presentation thing that I've been doing here, I'm having to create an entirely separate presentation just for Hesed's appearance in the Psalms.
Oh, yeah.
And that's because I believe, like, the number, like, whenever you're looking at the amount of times Hesed occurs in a biblical book, I believe the second most prominent occurrence is in, like, I think maybe Chronicles or maybe 2 Samuel or something like that. And I think it's like 17 occurrences or something. Whereas when you get to Psalms, it's like hundreds of more than 100 times it shows up in Psalms. And the second most popular book is like Chronicles or Samuel. Right? And that's like 17. So the word Hesed shows up most predominantly in the music of the people of Israel. And that should tell us something.
Usually praising God.
Well, and that should tell us something, because when we sing about things that we love. That's why it's kind of scary to me whenever modern worship music is mainly me-centric, because it seems like we're more in love with ourselves than we are with God. And if you look at music in our other, like in the culture that surrounds us, they sing about things they love. They'll sing about women, they'll sing about drugs, they'll sing about alcohol, they'll sing about money. Like, a lot of the stuff that, like, what you love is the thing that inspires you to sing. The very first song in the whole Bible is whenever Adam looks to Eve and says, "This at last is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." Because it's love, right? That's what causes us to sing, and Hesed is at the root of all of that, right? And so whenever you look to people's music, you can see what they're in love with. And to the people of Israel, Hesed is super, super important. And so that was just kind of a long little tangent talking about why it frustrates me so much that we don't translate this consistently.
Yeah.
And that why this, to me personally, why I think this whole series is very important. But let's actually walk through this. It shouldn't take us too long because we're kind of just summarizing these commandments a little bit.
Right.
So God spoke all these words, right? These are going to be the 10 words called the Decalogue. I, Yahweh, am your God who brought you from the land of Egypt, from the house of slavery. You can see him speaking as a king.
Right.
Right? He is a king issuing forth his law, and he says, this is who I am, this is what I've done for you, therefore listen up. Right? I am Yahweh, I am your God, I brought you from the land of Egypt, from the house of slavery. You are free people dwelling in front of this mountain because of me, and this is what I have to say. First and foremost, you shall have no other gods before me. Right? The word before here, actually, if I don't have my phone with me to look this up right now, but I'm sure in Hebrew that this says like li paneh, which means before my face, literally. That's what I imagine it would probably say. Typically, we translate that as before me because it sounds kind of weird, but I kind of like before my face because it's the Hebrew is a very like nitty gritty like physical language, and so a lot of the language is imagery type stuff. Yeah. And so, like, I don't like whatever we translate, like, before me, because it doesn't get it across. Like, before my face.
Yeah.
Because I think that's what he's speaking of here, right? Well, as an English reader, we read this, and we think, God needs to be your number one. That's not what he's saying here. He is speaking as a king on a throne, and he says, I don't want any other gods in my presence, right? You cannot allow them in. That's not allowed. Like, it's not, he doesn't want to be your number one. He doesn't want you to have side gods.
Yeah, like a 2, 3, 4, 5.
He's got to be the only one, right? No Baal, no Ashtaroth, no Ra, no Ishmut, no none of these other gods, no Dagon. In modern examples, right? You cannot allow social media to become your god, right? This is forbidding you from having other gods, right? You can't allow money to go in there, right? God has to be your one and only. And that's one thing that David is praised for. Whenever King David shows up and everything, like his whole thing is he's going to never look left or right, right? His eyes were always focused on God. Even whenever he fell into sin, he was always focused on Yahweh. Whereas his son fell into sin because he allowed other things to raise up as gods. Whereas God is saying, I'm the one who took you out of Egypt. I'm the one who proved that all the other gods were just lame. Worship me only.
Yeah.
Then you get to the second commandment. And typically, as Christians, we kind of conflate these two, together. But there is a distinction. There's a clear distinction between these two things. He says, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on earth beneath, or that is in the water below. Okay, so the first thing, we have no other gods. Second one, no idolatry. Can you help kind of break down what the difference between those two things are?
Yeah. So the first one we were talking about how it's, talking about no other gods in his presence. So don't have God as your number one, but you can have a 2, 3, 4, 5. It's like God is your one, your only, that's it. But the second one, it's talking more about don't try and like conform God into something physical. So you could still like say that God is your one and only, but like you worship him through, they could worship him through this like golden statue.
Yes.
He's saying like you cannot put me in a box. Like I don't belong in a box of any sort. I don't belong in an image. I don't belong in a statue because I can't be there. I don't work that way.
Yeah.
So it's you worship me for who I am, and you don't have something physical in order to talk to me. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned the golden statue thing. Whenever we get to Exodus 32 and the golden calf scenario, they're actually breaking the second commandment, not the first.
Yeah.
Because whenever they refer to the golden calf, they call him Yahweh.
Yeah.
Right? And so they still think they're worshiping God.
Yeah.
But they're trying to confine God to a image.
Yeah.
Right? They're trying to make this small image a picture of the God whose nostrils can split the waters.
Right. Yeah.
And that's really what God's getting at here, right? So idolatry and worshiping another God are actually two separate things that we often conflate, but that's because they do kind of go hand in hand, right? Because typically one leads to the other or something like that.
Right.
And typically they are different, but God's clarifying, no, there's a spiritual devotion and a physical devotion as well. Yeah. The first one is dealing with your heart, right? You shall not worship any other God from your heart. The second commandment is dealing with don't try to make a physical thing that represents me.
Because it's not
right?
going to happen.
And like, there's nothing wrong with, I guess, making something that represents him as long as you're not worshiping it, right? Because I have seen some people, one thing that they have against The Chosen is they're like, how dare you try to portray Jesus? And I'm like, okay, well, as long as you're not worshiping Jonathan Rumi as Jesus, that's an issue. And I have seen some fans who have said stuff like that. They're like, oh, I picture Jonathan Rumi when I pray. And I'm like, probably don't do that.
That's not good.
Don't do that. Like, he is not Jesus. He is an actor portraying Jesus. There's a clear distinction there, right? And I think that's what God's getting at here, right? Don't worship anything. Don't make for yourself a carved image or any likeness or of anything that's in heaven above or that's on earth beneath or that's in water below. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, Yahweh your God, am a jealous God, responding to the transgression of fathers by dealing with children to the third and fourth generations of those who reject me. And so God, he takes this very seriously. He's like, don't do that. He is very serious about this. People, like skeptical people, will look at the word jealous here and they'll be like, oh, God's so petty. No, God, it's understandable, right? I mean, if you are married to somebody and, you know, like, and your wife is running around with all these different guys, flirting with all the different guys, you have the right to be jealous because y'all made a covenant to one another. Right? Y'all made a covenant and they have no right to do that.
Yeah.
And right here, God is making a covenant with them. And he's saying, I am your God, you are my people, and they are going to say, yes, we are.
Yeah.
Therefore,
by accepting that.
Yes, they've accepted it, and therefore he has the right to be jealous because they have accepted that deal.
Also, that's kind of one of those things where it's like he's the God of the universe who creates everything. So like if anyone can be jealous, it would be him because he's the one who created jealousy.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So it's you can't really say like, oh, God can't be jealous.
Right. Yeah, exactly. We're the ones who typically abuse it.
Exactly.
And he says that he responds to the transgression of fathers by dealing with children to the third and fourth generations of those who reject me. This really doesn't go into our discussion of Hesed, and I know that we kind of need to speed this up a little bit because we're almost running out of our hour. But I do want to address this just because people will kind of look at this as a contradiction in the Bible, because there are other places where God says that he will not visit the transgression of people upon the future generations. And they view this as a contradiction. I think that they actually work really well together because on one instance, God is saying, I think it's in Ezekiel or something like that, what he's saying is that he is not going to count, like if I were to sin and I have a kid, that sin is not guilty of my sin. That kid is not guilty of my sin, right? That's not how that works, right? But right here, I think he's saying that children might receive the consequences of their father's sin, right? Because if I were to go out and just gamble with all my money and lose all my money, that was my sin, but my kids are going to have to pay for it, right? It doesn't mean that they're guilty of it. It just means that they have to deal with the consequences. And I think that, so God says that he will not visit the guilt of somebody upon future generations, but the consequences will be felt there. And that's what he's saying right here, right? So if you worship idols, you might be sent into exile, and your kids are going to have to deal with the consequences to the third and fourth generation. And that's exactly what we see.
Well, we're going to see that whenever they go into the promised land.
Exactly. But this is also what he says. And showing Hesed to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Do you see what he did there?
Contrasted?
Well, yeah, but do you see the contrast? On one end, he's like, I will visit the consequences of your sin upon 3 or 4 generations, right? 3 or 4, not that many.
Right, yeah. It's
but
not more abundant.
I show Hesed to thousands, right? So whenever you see the character of God, if you have a balance here, he leans heavily towards the side of graciousness and to being loving and kind. And we see this, like, he's not just emptily saying this, we see this throughout the Bible. How many times, like go to the Old Testament prophets. Right? If you've been tracking with us in that series, you'll see that most of those prophets are getting onto the people for sin. Whereas realistically, God was showing them grace by sending prophets at all. He should have just sent them right into exile or should have just destroyed them. But instead, he sends prophets because he's showing Hesed. He's like, hey, guys, you might not want to do that. I'm telling you, God doesn't like it. And so he's showing them compassion and patience and graciousness and love by sending the prophets to begin with. And we see this again and again to where there are times where God finally does put the hammer down and people are going to have to pay the consequences. But far more often, God shows Hesed.
Yeah, we see that in Judges. Like, he sends judges over and over again, and then eventually gets to a point where he's like, okay, if you're not gonna like serve me, then you have to find your own judge, type of thing. But over and over again, he sends like countless amounts of judges. He's like, don't do it, and they just keep on not following, getting worse and worse and worse.
Yeah, and ironically, whenever we get to Samuel, like so in Judges, he says, you know what, go find your own judge, I'm tired of helping you guys out. And they go find this guy named Jephthah, right? And you go to Samuel, and whenever Samuel talks about Jephthah, he's like, God sent you Jephthah. And it's like, so even whenever God said he wasn't going to help them out, he did help them out, right? And so that's really the importance of Hesed right here. But once again, see where this is building up to. God is showing that he is characteristically a God of Hesed, right? Yes, he will show wrath. Yes, he will punish people. But that's to 3 or 4 generations.
Yeah.
But he will for sure show Hesed to thousands, right? So if you have the weight here, it's characteristically this, right? Because character traits are not set in stone things. They are what you are typically more prone to do.
Right.
Right? And so we see how this is being set up as a character trait that God's going to reveal about himself, right? I am a God who visits punishment upon 3 or 4 generations, but I show Hesed to thousands.
Yeah.
Right? And you're like, oh, so it's like part of your character. And he's like, now you're on the right track, right? So they already saw that in chapter 15. Now they see it in chapter 20. And then in 34, it's going to be explicitly stated. Then verse 7, he goes on and says, you shall not take the name of Yahweh your God in vain, for Yahweh will not hold guiltless anyone who takes his name in vain. And I mainly just included that to show that there's a shift of thought that just kind of continues on going forward. And then you see more different commandments there.
Right.
And so really, verse 6 is the one that sticks out right there. Is there anything else that you kind of have, like, that you want to mention about how it shows up here in the 10 Commandments?
What do you mean?
Oh, I was just saying, like, is there any,
general?
just in general, is there anything you wanted to comment before we start wrapping up the video?
Oh, I don't think so. I think we covered it all pretty well.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it's cool that this word shows up here just because, just historically speaking, the 10 Commandments are the things that, if the modern Christian knows anything about the Levitical law,
it's the 10
typically
Commandments.
It's the 10 Commandments,
Yeah.
right? Typically we kind of ignore all the other 603 laws. But people typically know the 10.
Yeah.
Or they've heard of them, right? You don't have to be a Christian to have heard of the 10 Commandments.
Yeah.
But I think it's cool that Hesed shows up there. And it really doesn't show up in any of the other ones, at least in Exodus, right? Because in Exodus 34, whenever we encounter it, that's not going to be a commandment. That's going to be a dialogue between Moses and God.
Yeah.
And so I think it's cool that Hesed shows up during the one part that, historically speaking, Christians and Jews alike are going to kind of gravitate towards. Yeah.
I also just want to say, I was just thinking about, like, God saying this and the Israelites listening to it. It's very convincing to be like, okay, let me follow what God's saying, because he's like, he's going to show Hesed 1,000 generations. Like, it's so abundant to where it would be like, okay, we could take like 3 or 4 generations of like getting in trouble, or we could have like 1,000 generations of like greatness. And he's like, okay, yeah, I'll take that side. Like, it's kind of funny how he words it, because there's obviously one side that's better than the other.
Well, yeah, and because he's speaking hyperbolically here, right? I mean,
Right.
1,000 generations, that's a long time. That's like what, 40,000 years, if you're saying like a generation's 40 years.
Yeah.
Right? That's like 40,000 years. He's speaking hyperbolically here.
Right.
He's making a point. He's like, on one end, you can have my wrath if you worship another god, or you could just allow me to shower grace and love and kindness and loyalty to you. Which option do you want?
Yeah, which implied, since the word like Hesed is being used, which is implied that they don't deserve it, which leaves room for them to like mess up. You know what I mean? So like it leaves room for them to mess up to where he's not saying like you have to be absolutely perfect. So it leaves room for them to like have some mess ups, but it's not, you know, as bad as what the other stuff that
I can give you what you deserve for a few generations, or I can just lavish upon you what you don't deserve for thousands.
Yeah.
Which one do you want? And that's a good offer, right? Yeah. It's like, hey man, I can throw you in jail for 2 days, or I can give you $1 million for the rest of your life. Like, obviously you're going to take the $1 million, right? I mean, like, one option is clearly better. And how much more impressive is it whenever it's the God whose voice is booming down from the mountain, and you literally just saw what this God could do?
Yeah.
And he's offering you this deal, and you're like, it's free real estate. That's a good deal. Yeah. And so there is the first 2 occurrences of Hesed in Exodus. We actually managed to make it the full hour, so yeah, there we go. I don't know why an hour just seems like a good time to me. I mean,
I think so.
We could have made it briefer, but I don't care. Hopefully y'all don't mind either. And so yeah, there's our first 2 occurrences of Hesed, and the next week we are going to be hunkering down, because as you can see, it just shows up in 2 verses in chapter 34, and they're right next to each other. It's chapter 34, verse 6, and chapter 34, verse 7.
So we're gonna be hanging
and
out
so
there.
we're going to just be hanging out in chapter 34. We're going to dive deep into that chapter. Well, not as deeply as I'd like, because really, I think we actually spent some time with a group recently where we spent like 2 hours covering like that chapter. So
deep enough in an hour.
Deep enough to get the point across.
Yeah.
But yeah, so thank you once again for joining us on this. I've really been enjoying going through this. Honestly, just personally.
It's fun.
I've really been enjoying it. So thank you for joining me again, cutting out time to do that with me. And we will see you next time whenever we go through Exodus chapter 34. Until then, be sure to keep a smile on your face and don't let anybody steal your joy. My name is David.
And my name's Brian.
And this is Now Let's Be Honest. Once again, if you want access to these slides, be sure to go to nowletsbehonest.com/resources. And if you want to support us on Patreon, go to patreon.com/David Tate. Or you can do both of those things by clicking in the link in the description down below. We will see you next time. God bless. Peace out.
Bye.
You read a verse, you sing a hymn, the money's in the plate. Sundays you mark out for him, but even then you show up late. You bought the shirt, you wear the cross, but sin throughout the week. For 30 shekels and a noose, you kiss him on the cheek.